with you. I am Noam Scheiber. I'm a senior editor, which basically means staff writer at the New Republic.
And I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm the executive editor of the American Prospect. My daughter asked me the other day, my daughter said, does your magazine have a rival, like the Yankees have a rival in the Red Sox? Who's your rival? I said, well, we don't really have a rival. And she pushed me on it. I said, well, maybe the New Republic could be a little bit of a rival, but, we like each other, and we're all very dependent on people continuing to read our magazine, so I don't really think of us as
right, yeah.
Really go too far with that.
It's not zero-sum.
Right, exactly.
Positive-sum game here, yeah.
Exactly. There may have been a time when it was a little more of a rivalry.
Sharper elbowed affair.
Sharper elbowed affair, exactly.
So what's on your mind today?
Well, I don't know. There was a long piece about Rahm Emanuel in the New York Times magazine yesterday, and didn't really tell me too much that I hadn't learned from your piece about Rahm Emanuel, and I wrote something about Rahm Emanuel last week, and that seems to be the one of the big topics of the day. So I can't remember people having such a strong opinion about the White House Chief of Staff since you might not be old enough to remember John Sununu in the first Bush White House. That's the last time I can remember people actually having strong views about who the White House Chief of Staff should, whether they should stay or go or doing a good job or not. It's not like Andrew Card or Josh Bolton or John Podesta generated that much, generated opinions, much less anyone even knowing who they are.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I actually wrote sort of a follow-on piece, kind of a meta piece about the coverage and the reaction to the profiles.
Right.
And I think that's exactly right. It's funny because after I wrote the Rahm piece, multiple people, probably slightly more Republicans than Democrats, whether it's journalists or operatives, came up to me and said, something like, I can't imagine, it's incomprehensible to me that the White House let you write that piece, which I thought was a bizarre way of phrasing it. The idea that I was just waiting for a phone call from the White House and they said, okay, here's the piece, and they sort of laid it out to me in detail, and I took very fast notes and wrote it up. Obviously, there's a huge appetite for Rahm pieces, and therefore a huge number of people working on Rahm pieces. And whether the White House wants to see them out there or not, because the appetite is so large, a certain number of them are gonna happen. Whether the White House is playing very aggressive defense or not. And I think that goes back to the point you raised, which is Rahm, like Sununu, was a principal in his own right before becoming White House Chief of Staff. He was a very powerful member of Congress, probably on a fast track to becoming Speaker. He was the fourth ranking in the House leadership, and the other three ahead of him were all about 2 decades older. So it wasn't hard to imagine this guy as Speaker. Sununu obviously was governor of New Hampshire, a powerful, power broker in his own right. And I think there's just you have strong personalities, A, and B, these people are principals and often have been, before becoming Chief of Staff, the subject of profiles already. So it's not surprising that this appetite would exist. John Podesta, I think the world of. I think it was a tremendously competent and successful Chief of Staff. But the fact is no one had ever heard of John Podesta before he became Chief of Staff. He was before that Deputy Chief of Staff. Before that he was an aide to Tom Daschle. Before that he was Staff Secretary. So I think he was Staff Secretary. So he had been a mostly anonymous behind-the-scenes player, as had a number of these guys. So I think it's kind of an apples to oranges comparison. And again, the idea with all this appetite and interest in Rahm Emanuel, partly sort of as a residual, as a function of sort of residual interest. I think it's just unrealistic to expect the White House would be able to somehow, kill all of these or stonewall all of these.
Right. Well, the other question is whether some of the writing about Emanuel, particularly, where this started off, where there were a couple very tough pieces, the piece that Ed Luce wrote in the Financial Times, and then there were a couple of what really did look to me like pretty deliberate, defenses of Emanuel, most notably Dana Milbank's in the Washington Post. It was really hard to not, and I'm sort of neutral. Neutral on this issue, but the issue of Rahm. But I thought the Milbank piece was a particularly shocking, way of certainly conveying an Emanuel point of view about other people in the White House and the president, and things like David Axelrod is useless because he's too in love with Obama. I mean that you're definitely seeing unless those stories were just wrong. And I know that Milbank has said to lots of people that he never spoke to Rahm Emanuel, and that's fine. That's obviously that's probably true. But it did seem to be something. I don't want the White House chief of staff, opening the curtain in any way on these little rivalries. I mean, some news about them will come out, but maybe I don't know. I mean, Peter Baker in the Times Magazine made a pretty strong case that this was not. It was actually not even. Emanuel kind of orchestrating these stories secondhand. It was really pretty, it's like he talks to a lot of people. People kind of know that's his view. Yeah. And you made a similar case, right?
Yeah, I think that's largely right. I mean, you raise a couple of points there. One is the Dana piece, which was, the most overt and probably over the top. I think it was in some ways kind of a little bit of a caricature.
But almost like deliberately over the top.
Yeah, I think that's right. It was, Dana has a particular style. He's kind of snarky and hyperbolic and does kind of, cultivate this bomb thrower persona. So I think some people probably didn't interpret the Dana column in the spirit in which it was offered. And obviously when there's such intense interest in the subject, the column may go out outside of the natural, a couple of concentric circles beyond its normal readership. And so, people might not have quite understood where Dana's coming from. I think the other thing about Dana is, he's a New Republic alum, and what we prize at the New Republic is counterintuition and a sort of contrarian take. And I think Dana is very good at that.
And that's where we try to be, that's where we're your rivals. We try to be very. We're counter-contrarian.
Exactly. You guys are a little more straight, a little more earnest in approaching the subject directly, rather than undertaking all sorts of contortions to make the most novel point. But I think Dana noticed a sort of CW forming as sort of you get socialized to do at TNR, and had been close to the situation and knew, just from his own read and reporting that it was, the CW was probably a little overstated and probably wrong in some ways. So he sort of saw an opportunity to correct it and did it in his kind of usual, over-the-top snarky style. So I think that explains the Dana piece. And then as for my piece and the other Washington Post piece, I have to say, and I said this in a web piece that I wrote after the fact, I started on this piece back in December before Rahm kind of became topic A, though he's never too far from topic A, I guess. And had been working on it for a while, long before I even talked to anyone at the White House. So it was definitely sort of ongoing, and I can assure you that Rahm, or people close to Rahm, did not initiate the piece. In fact, it took a certain amount of persistence on my part just to get certain people who know Rahm, who have worked with him in the past, to even talk to me. So it was by no means an inside job or orchestrated in any way. And again, if you look at the Washington Post piece by Jason Horowitz, you get the distinct sense that most of the reporting happened on the Hill. Right. He even says, explicitly that people like Axelrod and Rahm, of course, didn't talk to him, but you get the sense that the White House kind of didn't play ball at all, and it was all Hill driven. And of course, people on the Hill know Rahm's view, as you say. They've been colleagues with him for years, and he still works out at the House gym, and so everybody knows. It's easy to imagine how Rahm's views sort of seep into the Hill, the sort of conversation on the Hill. Right. So I really do think this was kind of basically a sort of a CW had formed, and people had decided that the CW, well, maybe it contained a kernel of truth, had decided to push back against it, and a couple of us try to do that at the same time, and you end up with this kind of Rahm, intense scrutiny of Rahm at the same moment. Right.
Yeah, no, I'm actually increasingly. My first reaction especially to the Dana Milbank piece was to be a little horrified by it, but I think I think that analysis is kind of right. I just want to note in passing, just reading the Peter Baker story today, there's one significant reason why a New Republic story about Rahm Emanuel has an advantage over a New York Times story about Rahm Emanuel. Do you know what that is?
I'm curious. No, I'm curious.
It's the ability to use the F word. You got to be able to use. You can't write about the guy without being with these euphemisms. I call it. With the Times, I call it the Larkin rule because there's the famous poem by Philip Larkin with the line "They fuck you up, your mom and dad," and the New York Times once had to they quoted it as "they mess you up," which is you don't bother quoting the poem if you can't actually quote the poem.
That's right.
It's like don't bother writing about Rahm Emanuel if you can't use the F word.
That's right. No, it's a style guide that's unsuited to the subject.
Yeah,
unfortunately. At TNR we are proudly PG-13. We are happy to drop the F-bomb when necessary, and even at times when not. So it absolutely that's true.
I think that now of course we also have the problem that sometimes blogging heads goes on the New York Times website, and we now just ruined the chance of that happening.
Oh, that's true.
By actually dropping the word, not by making fun. I'm sure they're happy to accept the criticism, but we actually ruined it. Oh well.
That's right. That's right. So one other thought that was interesting to me about one kind of meta thought about the Rahm profiles, and I'd be curious to get your take on this. I sort of thought they fell into kind of two categories. One is kind of grand strategy or just strategy. People saying Rahm was right on military tribunals rather than civilian trials for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and other war on terror suspects. And so there were a lot of kind of critiques of Obama for not following Rahm's strategic advice. And then, my piece and Peter Baker's piece at times I thought kind of operated more on the level of tactics. It was kind of whatever you think of Rahm as a strategist and as a policy guy, he does have this sort of tactical expertise, and not following it in certain situations may have been costly. And I thought in the lumping together of all these four pieces, just because they happen to come at the same time, those differences got a little muddled, and so I'm always eager to sort of put to disentangle them a bit. And I was curious if if you buy that distinction.
Yeah, no, I definitely buy that distinction, and I think they're all questions with probably the exception of the military tribunals, which I feel very strongly about, and I think it's also not a smart deal that Emanuel's getting into. And generally, I don't actually want to know. It's interesting. We know too much. I think he would say we know too much about what his views are. I really don't want to know his views. I want the White House to kind of speak, especially on something like that, where the Republicans are looking to savage anything, or manipulate anything long before before it comes out. I don't quite want to know about that. On the rest, tactical judgments and your views about things are sort of hard to separate, and I think a lot of the times liberals who are critical of a particular position, let's say things about healthcare and so forth, it's as much a strategic or tactical judgment that they're making, about why it's important to press for the strongest possible public option or something like that. Right. It's as much like that's the only way we'll have a bargaining chip or something like that as it is really deeply about policy. So those are a little hard to disentangle. What interested me was the interesting reaction on the left of there's a faction out there that's still fighting a fight about the 2006 election. Yeah. When he was the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, so you immediately got this blast of Dan Frumkin in the Post, in particular, and Katrina Vanden Heuvel with this kind of who cares what he thinks now? We knew he was trouble, but because he's basically the theory goes something like this: here's Rahm Emanuel saying you got to be really careful, don't push Congress too far. These move gently in Congress, and he's actually the guy who elected all those people that Frumkin called them a bunch of conserva Dems. They're all his responsibility in the first place. So if he hadn't in 2006, elected all those conservatives, we wouldn't have any trouble now. And I dug into that thinking. I wrote a piece about Emanuel after 2006 that was really a review of a book that came out about him at the time.
Yep.
And I kind of came to the conclusion, well, he could have gone a lot further in 2006. There were some liberals who got elected kind of, they weren't his favorite candidates. They won primaries. Carol Shea Porter in New Hampshire is probably the best example. Right. And there were some, he probably could have gone further. But he actually went, he was a really non-traditional chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and that mostly they just put all their resources into like the 30, maybe 30 races at most. And protect their incumbents, and they really don't take a lot of chances. And he took a relative lot of chances, but there was a progressive argument that was basically like it was rooted in Howard Dean's 50 state strategy. You can elect progressives anywhere, and and that kind of is at the root of this criticism. And the fact is, the candidates that he elected weren't actually that conservative. They're not the people who've made the most trouble for the Obama agenda, And you actually can elect, conservatives and progressives everywhere. You really can elect a real progressive in, Heath Shuler's district in, Mountain, North Carolina. That just isn't going to happen. So, I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, it's not like I guess because of 2006 and some other things, particularly on the left, he's such a provocative figure that people are going to have views about him no matter what, which are really, again, it's like where tactics and views about substance coincide.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I think I read the same book. Was it the Naphtali?
Yeah. There's only one. Only one. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I agree with you. I think he takes a lot of flack, but actually he was creative and aggressive and expanded the field. And obviously the Democrats benefited from a good wave that cycle, as we hope the GOP, but suspect the GOP will, hope they won't, but suspect they will benefit from this time around. But, clearly he had, an important role in retaking the House in 06, and that was part of it. Just one other thing before we move on, which is, I agree with you that I think, on something like, here my sort of interest as a citizen and my interest as a journalist sort of diverge. But as a citizen, I agree with you. I don't necessarily want to know Rahm's view on the military tribunal question. And I can assure you that Rahm, as much as he talks to people on the Hill and around town, Rahm doesn't really want you to know that either. I mean, he's certainly not as discreet as other chiefs of staff might be, but he's a pretty loyal guy and really does see his mission as advancing the Obama agenda. So I'm not sure he loves to have that stuff out there. I think he's just sort of by nature less discreet about that stuff than a John Podesta type might have been in his position. Right. But maybe we should move on to something that's at the center of a lot of the Rahm discussions, which is healthcare. And it does now look like this weekend could be kind of could be kind of D-Day here. What's your sense as we approach what could be a historic vote, or actually could be a historic vote either way, I guess, if you buy the anxieties about the Obama presidency and its ability to survive a defeat on this?
Well, I mean, I think everybody's becoming increasingly more hopeful of something passing. I'm completely in the pass whatever you can camp. Especially once you do have the ability to use reconciliation and future reconciliation to turn it into something totally different. And you really somewhat different. I don't think it has to be totally different. You just really have to build the foundation here, and I'm not going to worry about the details at all. With the exception of some of the reproductive rights issues that are really that are potentially a big step backwards. But they're not going to put in the Stupak amendment either way. So
exactly. So the Senate bill on that question is certainly an improvement over the House.
Yeah. So I think it's I'm kind of optimistic about it. I haven't been. I'm worried about a backlash, especially I mean, I don't know where the politics are going to come out. So, if I were a member of Congress, I would just vote for what I think is the right policy. Right. Hopefully, if I were a member of Congress, I'd do that all the time. But I'm never convinced by anyone's certainty that you get this achievement and the administration has its momentum, or you fail and people that you're another Jimmy Carter, you failed. I think, the sad truth is, you fail, people shrug and say, well, once again, we didn't pass health reform. In that sense, he's no worse than any other president we've ever had who didn't pass health reform. But it's an interesting question, and it still is. I do go back to the question that comes up in the context of the Rahm Emanuel debate, which is, which was his push to do it in a smaller, more incremental way. And I've always been in the camp of, do big things, ambitious deals.
Right.
I have to say, you don't get to rerun these experiments, but the price, the political price, and the price in momentum that has been paid for this effort, even while doing everything opposite of the way the Clinton administration did it, you're kind of in the same. They're kind of in the same boat. It really does make me wonder about that. Incremental projects have a pretty good track record in this country.
Yeah, it's interesting. Spoken like a true Senate veteran. Something we said. No, I agree. I mean, a couple things. I mean, I do still, and I sort of lay this out in my piece about Rahm. I think you're by and large right, and I think the White House understood that, and Rahm certainly understood that. But I have a line in the piece about, there's no 1,000-page bill in history that kind of smelled great after a couple of months, right? There's just too many compromises you have to make along the way, and too many convoluted, arrangements and line items that the opposition is always going to be able to pick them out and wrap them around your neck and make it look really bad. So, so that's A. And that's certainly true of healthcare, obviously. But I think sort of given that the president was really intent on doing a big comprehensive reform this year, or last year, I guess, was the original hope. I still think that tactically, Rahm's approach is kind of unennobling as it was in any given moment, was sort of the right move in the way you might have been able to pull this off. And that was, you make these deals, you kind of co-op pharma, you co-op the insurers, you co-op the hospitals, you co-op the doctors, and you hold your nose, and it's not great because they get deals worth tens of billions of dollars to them, whereas in the perfect world, that money could go right to people, to patients. Right. But you hold your nose and you do it because you want to move it quickly and you don't want to get bogged down in trench warfare. And I thought that theory was basically right. If you were going to do the comprehensive bill, you kind of needed to do that so that you could move it quickly. And I think the problem is I kind of lay out the piece is at various points they sort of got away from that and they kind of worked at cross purposes. So, in the summer, last summer, they decided, okay, well, we do have we have this kind of cooptation strategy, but we kind of need an enemy too because the messaging is going really badly. So we'll start taking on the insurers. And in the abstract, that's a really good message, and I think it did help somewhat. The insurers are a really inviting enemy, and people get driven to distraction by the insurance company bureaucracies and all the things insurance companies do to increase their profits, but basically, scrimp on the value and the quality of your care. And so, had they maybe started with a kind of we're going to make insurers the enemy strategy from the beginning, that there might have been something to be said for that. But they started with, I think, an approach that had a better chance of success, which was kind of cooptation, and I think they kind of needed to stick with it rather than kind of going half cooptation, half kind of populist and finding convenient enemies. I agree with you. Comprehensive reform was always going to be hard. I thought Rahm's approach probably had the best chance of success. And they kind of got away from it a bit, and I think that probably extended the amount of time that it took to pass this thing, ultimately to the detriment of being able to do it, at least do it efficiently.
Well, I mean, there's two alternatives on either side from the path that they took.
Yeah.
One alternative is just, we're going after, we're taking on enemies, we don't care, we'll take all your Harry and Louise and we'll double it and we'll do it fast at the peak of our political capital. Who knows what would have happened in that situation? It's a scary thought. And the other approach, the other extreme is, we'll expand S-chip, we'll do cover all kids, we'll do this little bit here, we'll see as things get more comfortable, we'll have some bipartisan blah, blah, blah. Maybe we'll do maybe eventually we'll do something like the Wyden-Bennett approach. And that also wasn't tried. And you can't test what they did against either of those possibilities, but either one of them was was potentially an interesting other option. And the other thing, it's interesting to think about. This is what I just wrote a column about this. All of this backlash happens in a kind of real time. That people, you say that no 1,000-page bill smells good, but most of the time, that room is totally closed. It's really a closed process in the past, and there's a lot of kind of nostalgia about, somebody asked me the other day, where are the giants of the Senate, the Jacob Javits and the Warren Magnuson and whatever. And it's like, I don't think these people are necessarily inferior people. The great thing about the giants of the Senate were, they were white men who knew they were entitled to rule, and they had a level of arrogance. That they did whatever they wanted. They never went to a town meeting where somebody said, I printed out this bill from the internet, and can you explain to me what's in Section 521? It would never happen. Nobody even knew how they voted. It's like when the Americans for Democratic Action first produced like vote scores. It was a radical innovation, and nobody else did it for like 30 years. So. There was no accountability and transparency, and so they were able to be, fairly arrogant. That's what allowed, Evan Bayh's father was a great, courageous man, and Evan Bayh is, a dull, timid wimp who left without leaving a single mark on the Senate. I don't think that's personal. I don't think that's entirely a matter of personality. It's like these guys they don't know what it. They seem so gutless, partly because it's just a different environment it's a different world we're in. And I don't want to go back to that, We're not going to.
No, it's a great point, and everyone sort of, you hear a refrain like, oh, either Obama needs to be LBJ or he needs an LBJ working with him, and we wish that Rahm would be LBJ. But the question arises, could LBJ be LBJ?
Yeah, that's right.
Probably not is the answer.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, there's certainly, right, exactly. I mean, Rahm in the House was a little bit of a larger-than-life figure, but he wasn't, he wasn't even close to being able to do what LBJ was able to do in pushing together Southern Dems and, creating coalitions. And, you didn't have people who were like, oh, I saw a poll in my district that I might lose. I have to vote no on. You got to give me a pass. I got to vote no on this. Right.
So I think that's a terrific point. One other thing I wanted to go back to was something you raised earlier about just not having a lot of confidence in your ability to predict how this will play out. Right. Whether whether it passes or whether it fails. And I think that you have unquestionably the wise attitude toward that. I think there's clearly a decent amount of uncertainty involved here. The way I think about it though, and what gives me, I guess. A bit more certainty, or at least the feeling that I can be more certain, even though I may very well be wrong, is just kind of a simple thought experiment. And it occurred to me, it's by no means very sophisticated, but it occurred to me when this guy Micah Curie in upstate New York a couple weeks ago announced that he was going to be a no vote, having voted for the package in November in the House. And I tried to Talking Points memo put out some numbers on their site about Curie's district, and I think he won in 2008 52-48, and Obama carried his district 50-48. So he ran about 2 points ahead of Obama. And my thinking was, okay, let's be generous and suppose that was a particularly weird year. So he would normally run 4 or 5 or 6 points ahead of Obama. Obama in 08 was just a rock star, so he was going to run a little above of where he normally would. So let's just say, generously that Micah Curie normally runs 6 points ahead of Obama, right? And if Obama's kind of in the high 40s, low 50s nationally, and that's kind of a conservative district, then maybe Obama today is about 45% in his district, right? So if Obama's at 45%, he runs about 5-6 points ahead of Obama. As we talk today, he's right on the bubble, basically, of getting reelected. Now, if healthcare fails, And we hear all these stories, or people in Michael Curry's district hear all these stories about Obama and his liberal overreach and how it, and how the president is inept and he just misread the mood of the people. It strikes me that it's very likely that Obama will go down from 45 to like low 40s or upper 30s or even mid 30s in Michael Curry's district. At which point, running 5 points ahead of Obama is going to do him absolutely no good. You know, if Obama's in the high 30s, then Michael Curry is in the low 40s, and that ain't enough. You know,
right? Yeah.
So my feeling is Michael Curry is dead if this thing dies, and if it passes, maybe Obama's. Maybe it's not super popular in his district. Maybe Republicans make some inroads. Maybe Obama holds his own at 45%. But then, Michael Curry still has a fighting chance of getting over that 50%, getting to that magic 50 plus 1. So I guess that's the way I think about it. Now, obviously, there are a number of assumptions in there and premises in there, each of which could be flawed. But that's kind of the basic way that I think about it, and why it's basically, to me, it seems irrational for a guy like him to switch his vote.
Well, there are two things. I mean, I think there are two things I would say in relation to that. One is, like, if you were the House Whip and you pulled Mike Curry, and you needed him, could you persuade him of that?
Right.
Could you persuade him? You're better off getting this thing passed, even as you're going to be the deciding vote and all that. Could you persuade him of that? And the answer is probably no. And the other thing, but the other part is, like, in the end, is that going to be true? I mean, there's, in the, what's it going to be, 7-8 months, a lot between now and the election, a lot of things are going to happen. The economy is going to have a huge effect on those numbers. I mean, I do think that, healthcare could fail, Obama could drop 5 points, and then he could be up, and he could be up well into the mid 50s by the time of the election, or move in the other direction. Those other things matter a lot. And I've always thought that having been working on the Hill at the time of the Clinton healthcare thing, that we still remember that. That's the best known now episode of the early Clinton period. But by the time you got to the election in 1994, there were a lot of other things that were on people's minds, and healthcare was a long time earlier compared to the crime bill was one of the bigger things at that moment. And there was just a lot of stuff that got there'll be stuff between now and then. Yeah, exactly.
No, I agree. I think that's fair enough. So maybe we should pivot to one other big legislative item, which is reg reform. I guess there were some new developments today with Chris Dodd. So this is like the third iteration of the Dodd bill. Right. Basically, he had this kind of really hawkish bill maybe in the fall, and then he had these negotiations with first Richard Shelby and then Bob Corker to produce kind of a moderate bill that had a chance to pass, but then the liberals in the Senate and sort of around the country got upset that he was giving away too much. So now this is the kind of the compromise between the compromise and the liberals, right?
Right.
So what do you think? I mean, I guess there are a couple of new twists here. The biggest one that I saw just reading the coverage today was the Fed would kind of would go, and I think this was in his original bill, would basically the president of the New York Fed and maybe some of the other regional banks would be appointed by the president rather than a board of directors that comes partly from the private sector, which strikes me as terrific and a huge problem the way the Fed is constituted now. But it looks like basically the Consumer Financial Agency, which everyone was upset about the way it was trending, looks like it's basically in the same spot, so far as I could tell, which is it would be housed at the Fed, which a lot of people, including myself, are sort of exercised about, rather than making it an independent agency. What's your sense of where we still?
Well, I mean, you write about this more closely than I do. So I was really interested to see that engagement with the New York Fed, which in particular, which seems like a little bit of a it's such a direct, Wall Street entity, in a surprising, in a way that I kind of hadn't really understood until recently. That's where you really want to go after accountability for the Fed. It's not Bernanke and the Board of Governors. It's at the level of the regional Feds, and then the other ones are a little bit, they're sort of a little kooky. I think some of the Fed presidents. So it should be a little more, that's where you got to get the accountability. I thought that was good. I guess the question I would ask you is, how is this? On the surface, it looks like what George W. Bush used to say. I'm not going to negotiate with myself. It seems like
right.
why are you producing a compromise? Obviously, it didn't work to negotiate with Shelby and Corker, two of the sleaziest characters up there. But how is this not a kind of negotiating with yourself, where you're kind of taking parts of that compromise, but they're not going to vote for it anyway?
Yeah, I think we're seeing something sort of interesting here, which is basically you have Chris Dodd, who's not running for re-election, deciding that he really wants a bill. He wants something to pass. He wants a legislative achievement, particularly, amid the circumstances that basically drove him from running for re-election, which was his perceived closeness to Wall Street, his sweetheart deal from Angelo Mazzillo, the former head of Countrywide, which Dodd, says that he wasn't aware was a sweetheart deal, but nonetheless, Mazzillo thought it was. Given the circumstances, given that he's not running for re-election, Dodd really wants an achievement. He wants to be sort of redeemed. I can't blame him. It would be a nice end to his career. So that's his interest. On the other hand, I think the White House and maybe some of the congressional leadership is starting to calculate that we're better off just, making this a campaign issue, scoring some points with Republicans, using the kind of, tying them to Wall Street and tarring them as sort of obstructionists who are the only thing standing between the American people and real reform. And so I'm not sure that every other Democrat in the national office but Dodd, is that interested in having this pass this year. I mean, I don't think they'd be opposed to it if they could actually get a good deal, but I don't think they quite have the hunger for this that Dodd has, which is just a deal is more important than anything else. So I think that's what you've been seeing, which is Dodd, trying one thing and that doesn't work, then trying another and that doesn't work and trying a third thing, hoping to just kind of hit that sweet spot that can get 60 votes in the Senate. Whereas, every now and then the White House will sort of pipe up and say, no, we need a real consumer agency because, it's a good message. I mean, in addition to, I think, being a substantively good thing, they're willing to they're willing to kind of play hardball on this. And I think the irony is because the White House is willing to take a tougher line, it improves their negotiating position, right? Because they can say, no deal and just walk away, and the Republicans know that. On the other hand, Chris Dodd, because he really wants a deal, it kind of undermines his position a bit, and makes it actually potentially harder to get one because he's got a bigger circle to square. The combination of moving closer possibly to Republican demands, but then alienating, people on the left, both in the Senate and in the party generally. So I think that sort of explains why we've kind of been lurching around a bit. And I suspect at some point, go ahead.
In other words, you're saying he's not so much compromising with, the positions of Corker and Shelby as he is compromising with those two impulses within the Democratic Party.
I think that's right. I mean, obviously, the impulse to get a deal would involve some kind of compromise, with the Republicans, because their Democrats are going to lose enough votes from people, in South Dakota or Delaware or wherever that tend to vote with financial interests that they're not going to be anywhere close to 60 votes on their own, even if Scott Brown had never been elected in Massachusetts.
Right, so, but he can get it out of committee. He could get it out of committee and onto the floor on a partisan basis,
he
right?
Could, yeah. No, and that was actually originally the game plan. When he unveiled this really tough bill in the fall, they were initially going to just kind of ram it through the committee and then take their chance on the floor. But I think they just felt like the best chance of passing it were to broker a deal on committee and take that deal to the floor, because otherwise you're just going to run into the filibuster, on the floor, and you're not going to be much better off just having advanced the stuff.
Right.
So we'll see. I think it's sort of really interesting to see how it plays out. And I'm not sure the White House has completely decided, and the administration generally has completely decided how they want to play this. I think, if Dodd were able to get a deal that looked, reasonably good, that looked like a couple of Republicans would sign on to and could pass the Senate. They certainly, I think, wouldn't turn up their nose at that. But at this point, I think they're in this mindset that it just wouldn't be a bad thing to bloody their nose a bit on this.
I don't think I've really, heard that sense that I'm leaving it to a campaign issue. Which is sad for Don in a way, and also this thing needs to get done.
Yeah,
and as we go into next year with a reduced Democratic majority, plus a bunch of people who've gone through a tough election cycle where they're even more pounded by either the contributions or the denied contributions or the actual opposition of people who'll be affected by this bill. It's hard to imagine that we'll be in a politically better position next year.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think also there's only so far you can wrap this around the GOP's neck, right? So let's suppose, Republicans basically defect and there's no deal and the Democrats campaign on it and really beat up the GOP on it and that we come back next year and there's a relapse, right? Another round of financial crisis. I don't think it's going to help the Democrats that much to say, well, we really want to do this, but the GOP obstructed us. I mean, Obama's still president, and, there was a Democratic majority, so I think the Republicans have this played pretty well, I mean, it's going to be pretty hard to make that case, even though it may be substantively true. I mean, the Republicans certainly do want to oppose this. They don't want anything really substantively, that would have much of a change going forward. So I think the critique would, the defense would actually be true, but I think it would be completely lost on the vast majority of voters. So it would get them absolutely nothing when they needed it most.
Right.
So I think you're right. I mean, go ahead.
I have to say, and this comes back to some of the Rahm Emanuel stuff, if there was ever something that should have just been done in the first 3 months, it was this. Now, I mean, part of the problem is, healthcare, everybody knew exactly what they wanted to do. One reason for not doing it in the first 3 months is it wasn't actually clear what people wanted to do, or that there was even enough. There were even enough people within the administration and in Congress who actually understood the issue well enough.
That's right. Well, it's actually very, very interesting.
Wasn't there? Yeah.
I have a riff on this in my Rahm piece, and it turns out that this was very much a lively debate during the transition and early in the administration. Rahm actually, which may surprise some of his critics on the left, Rahm was very, very adamant that reg reform happened right out of the gate. He just thought that, you cannot justify spending hundreds of billions of dollars bailing banks out. You can't justify it politically without showing people that you're not going to let it happen again. It just didn't fly politically. And I think he was right about that. I think it was a great insight. The flip side was, as you say, I mean, Treasury was incredibly understaffed. I mean, the joke at the time was there are only 3 people in the building, Tim Geithner and 2 of his counselors, Lee Sachs and Gene Sperling. So, obviously that was hyperbolic, but that was kind of the joke.
But since Gene Sperling is there 36 hours a day, that counts as...
That's right. So it's like 3.5 people, right? So, these guys were incredibly overworked. I mean, they're literally working like 20, 22 hours a day, for several weeks, if not the first couple of months. So Geithner, basically pushed back and said, look, we don't have the manpower here. And he made a kind of principled argument, which was the financial markets are incredibly stressed out right now. And if we, in the course of trying to stabilize them, introduce this entire new regime that's kind of out of left field, it's going to set back the cause of calming the markets. Now, I happen to think Geithner believes that at the level of principle, and obviously was constrained by kind of manpower limitations. But I do think, sort of, in the best of all worlds, politically, you would probably want to do it early, not just because of the political reason that Rahm cited, which was, it's important to pair this with a bailout so people think they're not getting screwed. But, that was the moment when Obama was at his maximal power, right? So you could imagine him kind of ramming through something like that fairly quick.
Right.
So.
And Wall Street was at its least power, and it's kind of like you take your hits when it's like corporations that take the big loss in the year when they have the massive loss anyway. You might as well do that. Whereas now it's all, some proposal comes out. That's some strong proposal comes out. The Dow drops 150 points, and everybody on CNBC goes, there's the it's going to be a debacle. And you're never not going to have that situation.
That's right.
But you had much more ability to stand up to it when the market's already in the dumps, and you've got you have only everything after that is up. So
that's right. Terrific. Well,
all right.
I really enjoyed doing this.
Likewise, Noam, and let's do it again.
Absolutely. Have a good week.
Okay, my rival. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.